72-year-old widower Roberto Morales sat quietly in his small room in Austin, Texas, gazing out the window at the bustling city streets below. He had always been a man of pride, a man who valued his independence. But now his body had grown weaker, his memory hazier, and his heart heavier. Living with his son Alejandro and daughter-in-law Mariana, Roberto felt like a shadow of the man he used to be. Roberto had a plan. He had decided he no longer wanted to be a burden. The guilt gnawed at him every time he saw his grandson's room he now occupied, the quick goodbyes his family gave before heading to work, and the meals delivered by Teresa, their neighbor. The idea of moving to a nursing home seemed less like an exile and more like a relief for everyone. But beneath his stoic exterior, Roberto longed for something he couldn't name. He didn't just feel forgotten. He felt unnecessary. Roberto's life hadn't always been this way. His mind often drifted back to San Antonio, where he and his late wife, Sophia, built a life together in their small wooden home. Sophia had brought warmth to his world, her laughter echoing in every corner of their house. Roberto had adopted Alejandro when he married Sophia. The boy wasn't his by blood, but from the first moment Alejandro called him Papa, Roberto had vowed to give him everything. Together, they turned a modest home into a sanctuary filled with love, hard work, and simple joys. Roberto had been a man of the land, tending to his garden with the help of Palomo, his loyal horse. But all of that changed the night of the fire. One evening, Roberto lit a candle to fight the dark when a power outage left his home without light. Exhausted from a day of harvesting potatoes with Palomo, he fell asleep on the sofa. By the time he woke, the air was thick with smoke. Neighbors broke down the door, dragging him to safety, but the house, his memories, Sophia's belongings, and their shared life was reduced to ashes. When Roberto awoke in the hospital 24 days later, the doctors told him he had been lucky to survive, but he didn't feel lucky. He felt empty. When Alejandro brought him to Austin to recover, Roberto left not only his home behind, but also a piece of his soul. Life in Alejandro's home wasn't what Roberto had hoped. Alejandro and Mariana were busy with work and seemed distant, leaving Teresa, the neighbor, to care for his meals and needs. Though kind, Teresa didn't hold back her opinions. "They don't want you here, Roberto," she said one day, shaking her head. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children don't want to deal with us." Her words haunted him. On his birthday, Roberto sat alone with a slice of cake Teresa had left him. Alejandro and Mariana had wished him well that morning, but didn't stay to celebrate. The loneliness was suffocating. Roberto couldn't take it any longer. One evening, he cornered Alejandro. "Take me to a nursing home," he said firmly. "Sell my land in San Antonio. Use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Mariana." "Papa, not now," Alejandro replied with a sigh. "We'll talk about it later. I've had a long day." Roberto's frustration boiled over. "If you won't do it, I will. I'll find a nursing home myself." Alejandro simply patted his shoulder and walked away, leaving Roberto feeling more invisible than ever. Days bled into weeks, and Roberto's pleas to be taken to a nursing home seemed to vanish into thin air. Each night, he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the worn photograph of Sophia he kept tucked in his wallet, whispering apologies to her for the burden he had become. His heart felt heavier with every passing day, the silence in Alejandro and Mariana's home amplifying his loneliness. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, everything changed. Alejandro walked into Roberto's room, carrying a crisp white shirt, a pair of neatly folded slacks, and a new set of toiletries. Mariana followed, with fresh towels and sheets tucked under her arm. "Pack your things, Papa," Alejandro said, his voice steady but unreadable. "We're going on a trip." Roberto froze, his hands trembling as he clutched the photograph. The words echoed in his ears, filling him with a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. Finally, he thought, "they're taking me." He nodded silently. not daring to meet Alejandro's eyes, afraid that he might see pity or worse guilt. He packed quickly, methodically folding his few clothes with precision. His heart ached as he placed Sophia's photograph on top of the pile, zipping the suitcase with a finality that felt like a goodbye. The car ride began in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Roberto sat in the back seat, clutching his suitcase tightly, his knuckles white. Alejandro drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Mariana stared out the window, a small smile playing at her lips. To Roberto, her smile felt out of place, a hint of joy on what he believed was meant to be a somber day. As they left Austin city limits, the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets gave way to rolling hills and sprawling farmland. The scenery seemed to blur together, but to Roberto, every detail stood out vividly. The weathered fences lining the road, the clusters of wildflowers dotting the fields, the occasional old oak tree standing tall against the sky. The sights reminded him of his younger days, of drives with Sophia through the countryside, their laughter filling the air as they imagined growing old together. Roberto's thoughts drifted further into the past. He remembered Sophia's laugh, the way it bubbled out of her when he told one of his terrible jokes. He remembered Alejandro's first steps, how his little boy had stumbled and fallen into his arms, his giggles echoing through their home. And he remembered his garden in San Antonio, the rich, earthy smell of freshly turned soil as he and Palomo worked side by side to nurture their crops. He let out a shaky sigh, his eyes welling up. He wasn't just leaving his family behind. He was leaving behind a lifetime of memories, a home that no longer existed, and the dreams he and Sophia had once shared. Alejandro glanced at Roberto in the rearview mirror, noticing the old man wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "You okay back there, Papa?" he asked, his tone casual but concerned. Roberto quickly stuffed the handkerchief back into his pocket and forced a small nod. "See, just tired." Mariana turned around in her seat and smiled softly at him. "We're almost there. You'll feel better soon." Roberto nodded again, his throat tightening. Almost there. The words rang in his ears. Was it a promise of relief or a confirmation of his greatest fear? As the car climbed a winding road surrounded by dense trees, Roberto realized he no longer recognized the area. His heart began to race. There were no houses, no signs of civilization, only the occasional break in the trees where sunlight streamed through. The road seemed endless, stretching into a lonely horizon. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping his suitcase tighter. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "You'll see," Alejandro replied cryptically, a faint smile on his lips. Roberto's mind raced with possibilities. Was this road leading to a secluded nursing home, far from the city? Was this their way of leaving him behind, out of sight and out of mind? The car eventually slowed, crunching over gravel as it pulled into a clearing. Alejandro killed the engine and turned to face Roberto, his expression unreadable. "We're here, Papa." Roberto hesitated, his body stiff. Alejandro stepped out and opened the back door. He helped Roberto out of the car, guiding him gently as Mariana grabbed the suitcase. Roberto adjusted his glasses, his heart pounding in his chest. He squinted against the sunlight, expecting to see the dull gray facade of a nursing home. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Before him stood a house he recognized all too well. His house. But it wasn't the charred, blackened skeleton he had last seen. It was fully restored, gleaming as if it had been plucked from his memories and brought back to life. The white paint shimmered under the sunlight. The porch railings were sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled with a clarity that felt surreal. Roberto's knees buckled, and Alejandro quickly caught him. "Careful, Papa," he said softly. What is this?" Roberto stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro smiled, his eyes glistening. "Welcome home, Papa." As Roberto stood before the gleaming facade of his rebuilt home, his legs wobbled, and he clutched Alejandro's arm for support. It wasn't just a house. It was the life it represented, a life he thought had turned to ash along with its wooden beams. He blinked rapidly, trying to convince himself this wasn't a dream. "Come inside, Papa," Alejandro said gently, leading him toward the porch. Mariana followed, carrying his suitcase. Roberto hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing over the smooth, freshly painted railing. The smell of pine and varnish filled the air. Each step onto the porch felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had been resurrected. The front door creaked open, revealing the interior. Roberto gasped. The layout was familiar, yet everything felt new. Polished wood floors, walls painted in soft, warm tones, and furniture that echoed the cozy charm he and Sophia had once created together. On the mantel above the fireplace, a single-frame photograph caught his eye. A picture of him and Sophia on their wedding day, their smiles frozen in time. "How?" Roberto's voice broke as he turned to Alejandro. Alejandro gestured for him to sit in his old armchair, restored and reupholstered with the same fabric Sophia had once chosen. "Papa, we never planned to send you to a nursing home," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this house meant to you, so when it burned down, we made it our mission to rebuild it. We couldn't tell you because, well, we wanted it to be a surprise." Mariana chimed in, her hand resting on Roberto's shoulder. "We used the land you loved so much as a foundation for something new." The neighbors chipped in, too. Everyone wanted to help. Alejandro reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. "Do you remember those papers you signed months ago?" Roberto nodded, his brow furrowing. "You said it was to sell the land." Alejandro shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Papa. They were construction permits. We needed your approval to start rebuilding. Every nail, every beam, it's all for you." Roberto's eyes filled with tears, his breath hitching. I thought I had lost everything. Sophia, this house, everything." Alejandro handed him a thick photo album, its edges slightly singed but intact. "Not everything, Papa. Look." Roberto's hands trembled as he opened the album. Inside were photographs that had survived the fire. Pictures of him and Sophia dancing at their anniversary, Alejandro as a baby taking his first steps, and Sophia planting flowers in the garden. The pages smelled faintly of smoke, but the images were vivid, bursting with life. Roberto traced his fingers over a photograph of Sophia holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables, her smile radiant. "She loved that garden," he murmured, tears spilling onto the page. Just as he thought his heart couldn't take any more, a familiar sound reached his ears. A gentle whinny echoed from outside, pulling Roberto from his reverie. He froze, his eyes widening. "Is that?" Alejandro grinned and gestured toward the door. "Come and see." Roberto shuffled to the porch, his heart pounding. There, tied to a newly built post near the garden, stood Palomo, his beloved horse. The old stallion's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his mane freshly brushed. Roberto's breath caught in his throat as Palomo let out another whinny and stomped the ground, as if calling out to him. "Palomo!" Roberto exclaimed, tears now flowing freely. He hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. The horse turned its head, recognizing its old master instantly. Roberto wrapped his arms around Palomo's neck, burying his face in the animal's mane. "You're alive. I thought I'd lost you, too." Mariana joined Alejandro on the porch, watching the emotional reunion. "We found him a few weeks after the fire," she explained. "He'd wandered into the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped care for him until we could bring him back." Roberto stood there for a long moment, his hand gently stroking Palomo's mane. The warmth of the horse's body, the solid feel of the house behind him, and the presence of his family filled him with a deep, unshakable peace. He turned back to Alejandro, his voice choked with gratitude. "You did all of this for me?" Roberto asked, his voice trembling. Alejandro nodded. You've done so much for me, Papa. For us. This is just a small way to show you how much we love you. Roberto shook his head, overcome. This isn't small, Mijo. This is everything. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Roberto sat on the porch with Alejandro and Mariana. Palomo grazed peacefully in the yard, and the distant sound of crickets filled the air. Roberto clutched the photo album to his chest, a smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt whole. His heart, once heavy with loss and loneliness, was now brimming with joy. The home he thought he'd lost forever had been returned to him, not just in bricks and wood, but in love, effort, and family. I was wrong, Roberto said softly, breaking the silence. I thought I was a burden, but you've shown me that I'm anything but. Alejandro reached over and clasped his father's hand. You're not a burden, Papa. You're our foundation. Roberto looked at his son, then at the house, then at Palomo grazing peacefully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Roberto hugged Alejandro tightly. I'm so sorry, Mijo, he said. I doubted you and thought you didn't care. Alejandro shook his head. You've never been a burden, Papa. We just wanted to give you the home you loved. You deserve it. That evening, Roberto unpacked in his rebuilt home, his heart full for the first time in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the newly rebuilt house, Roberto found himself standing in the middle of the living room. His eyes darted from corner to corner. Every detail, every plank, every photograph on the wall spoke of love, dedication, and a son's unwavering commitment to his father. Alejandro stood beside him, a quiet smile on his face. Mariana had excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving the two men alone in the space that held decades of memories. Roberto's throat tightened. He turned to Alejandro, his voice trembling. Mijo, I don't know what to say. I doubted you. I thought you didn't care, that you wanted to get rid of me. Alejandro's eyes softened, and he stepped forward, placing a firm yet gentle hand on his father's shoulder. Papa, you've never been a burden. Not once. Everything we did, all the late nights, all the weekends spent building this house, it was all because we love you, because you deserve to be happy. The sincerity in Alejandro's voice was like a balm to Roberto's wounded spirit. Overcome with emotion, Roberto pulled his son into a tight hug. He held on as if letting go would undo everything, as if this embrace could convey the gratitude he couldn't put into words. I'm so sorry, Roberto whispered, his voice muffled against Alejandro's shoulder. I let my fears and loneliness blind me. I should have trusted you. Alejandro pulled back, just enough to look his father in the eye. You've done so much for me, Papa. You raised me, loved me, and gave me a life I never would have had without you. This is the least I could do for you. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken words. Alejandro gestured toward the old armchair near the fireplace, the very chair Roberto had spent countless evenings in, reading or simply gazing at the stars through the window. Come sit, Papa. There's more. Roberto sat down, his fingers brushing over the armrests. The chair had been reupholstered, but it still carried the same comfort, the same familiarity. Alejandro knelt beside him and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather-bound book. This, Alejandro began, handing it to Roberto, is a journal Sophia kept. I found it while sorting through some of the things we managed to save after the fire. Roberto's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Sophia's neat handwriting. As he read, her words seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. She had written about their life together, her love for him, and her dreams for their family. She wanted this house to always feel like home. Alejandro said quietly, I thought you should have this, so her voice can always be with you. Roberto's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. Thank you, he choked out. This means everything to me. Later that evening, after dinner, Roberto began unpacking his belongings. Alejandro and Mariana had left him to settle in, promising to return the next day with supplies to help him get started with his garden. As Roberto opened his suitcase, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He pulled out his old photo frames, placing them carefully on the mantel. A picture of Sophia smiling in their garden took center stage, her presence anchoring the room. Next, he arranged small keepsakes, a carved wooden bird Sophia had once gifted him, a brass key from the original house, and a clock that had been in the family for decades. Each item carried a story, a memory that was now intertwined with this new chapter of his life. As Roberto continued unpacking, he came across a small box at the bottom of his suitcase. Inside was an envelope addressed to Alejandro. It was a letter he had written weeks ago, during one of his loneliest nights in Austin. In it, he had apologized for being a burden and asked Alejandro to forgive him for the trouble he had caused. Roberto held the letter in his hands for a long moment before tearing it into pieces. "No more doubts," he said to himself softly. "Alejandro has shown me that love doesn't count burdens. It only counts blessings." Before turning in for the night, Roberto stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. Palomo stood grazing nearby, lifting his head as Roberto approached. He ran his hand along the horse's mane, speaking to him as if they'd never been apart. "We're home, Palomo," Roberto said with a smile. "And it's better than I could have ever imagined." The stars twinkled above, their light mirrored in the glistening windows of the house. For the first time in years, Roberto felt truly at peace. He had thought he had lost everything, his wife, his home, his purpose. But tonight, he realized he had gained something even greater: the knowledge that he was loved deeply and unconditionally. As he walked back inside and closed the door behind him, he paused for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of belonging. The weekends became a time of joy, as Alejandro and Mariana visited regularly. Roberto tended to his garden and cared for Palomo, rediscovering the peace he had thought was lost forever. While some elderly parents are abandoned or sent to nursing homes, love and understanding can create miracles. Alejandro may not have been Roberto's biological son, but the bond they shared was unbreakable, a testament to the power of family. What do you think of Alejandro's decision to rebuild his father's home instead of sending him to a nursing home? Would you have done the same or handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about this touching story. Please like if you enjoyed this story, and we will see you in the next video.